Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, thanks for coming along right at the end. So yeah, we're going to be talking about some of our experiences, some of our challenges with working with FME in an Agile software development lifecycle and some of the large Agile projects that we've worked on. So yeah, I'm Richard. So I've been working with FME for about the past 10 years. Initially as a developer, I'm now more of a delivery manager and lead an innovation team at Stop Hysteria. Stop Hysteria are a large European systems integrator, and they've got a component there that works in central government. So Pete and I both work in the central government sector. And as you can see, I've been having a great time in Vancouver, seeing some of the sites earlier on. So a bit of background of what we're going to talk about is that we've had lots of experience working on some large-scale Agile kind of GIS projects. Now, these are large-scale in both size, so there can be sometimes 50, 60 developers. They can last up to about 3 years. They're also very complex projects, so there's generally lots and lots of different moving parts. And actually, GIS is actually only a really small component. So even though some of these projects are very much about mapping data, about how we manage mapping data, the actual GIS component is quite small. So out of those 50 developers, there might be only 2 or 3 that are FME or GIS users. And that causes us some quite big challenges because it requires us to work with FME in a way that a normal software developer would do. And our experience with FME is it doesn't necessarily work and integrate in the same way that someone coding JavaScript can integrate into the project itself. So what we're going to go through today is go into some detail in a couple of examples of things that we found really challenging on these projects. And we'll go on a bit further on how our innovation team have then gone a bit further and thought, right, how can we really improve how we almost increase our professionalism with deploying, managing, testing, co-reviewing FME in some of these big Agile projects to see if we can work better and we can work closer with the software developers on those teams. So at that point, I'll hand over to Pete to go into some more detail.
Thank you, Rich. So as you can see from the pictures here, I'm the one that actually does the work on this project. So I've been working with FME for about 4 years now. Most of the time, this has been on very large projects, like Rich said. So one of the struggles has always been, how do we sort of, make this production ready, FME sort of code through several environments. So I just want to give a bit of background into sort of the data we're dealing with. So we're sort of covering, the main project we've been working on covers sort of all the land parcels in England. So we have to sort of use FME to sort of run some analysis on this, a lot of migration, sort of back to new systems and old systems. We need to sort of integrate this. We've got a bit of sort of bulk data downloads. So really we use it for all sorts of tasks throughout the project. It sits in a large ecosystem, sort of with lots of other software. We've got Python, JavaScript, and we sort of need to, the FME sort of sits in the middle of that and sort of manages the data. So when I'm talking about large-scale projects, they differ sort of to what I think a lot of people probably use FME for. So if you're using it for sort of an in-house project, then quite often there's only 1 or 2 developers, and you don't really have this production environment necessarily. You want to do sort of tasks which are just moving data around your organization. If this is the case, then FME's built in sort of, publish to repository, publish workbench, sort of, download from repository onto one sort of server. Works quite well. You don't need to worry too much about code reviews. You don't to worry about sort of, how many people are using it at the same time. So small scale, it's fine as it is. But what the problem that we faced was we can have sort of 10 developers working on these repositories, on these workbenches, and several environments. So the main sort of issue with that is that on large government projects, the production environment is sort of locked down, and particularly the test as well. You can't really get into it. Particularly, we only have FME server installed in these environments as well. Sort of the desktop version only sits in the development environment. So what this means is that you can't get onto, say, a server or a desktop to upload a version of a workbench in a test environment. We just don't have that due to sort of, security reasons. You can't have a firewall that's open up to, FME server and things and just be able to publish data there. So it causes sort of a big problem. So the problems that we sort of face are, so this pipeline I just spoke about, it's sort of testing FME, sort of a big issue for us, the versioning, and sort of how frequently we need to deploy. So the project we were working on was roughly a deployment a week at one period. So this has to get through several environments in this week. So a manual process isn't ideal for us. So unfortunately, that's what we had with our first iteration of this solution. So initially, what we sort of had to do, we were all quite new to FME when we sort of started the project, and particularly sort of the platform team that we had weren't really familiar with it at all. So we had to sort of come up with a way of sort of making these changes and getting them into the production environment. What we sort of came up with at first, which worked for a short period while we didn't have too many repositories, too many workbenches, was that using sort of the FME server sort of GUI, you could sort of download the full repositories. Sorry, not repositories, the full sort of server. And you get this fsconfig file. So you can sort of download, I think it's backup server it was called. I'm not sure this has changed. This is 2014 FME server we were using at the time. And you could click this sort of backup FME server, and it zips up the whole server for you. You get a config file. In our case, it was around sort of 100 megabytes. So what we realized that we could use the REST API for FME server. Using this, we could then take the config file, put it into a separate environment, and then use the REST API backup, or sort of restore the config file. So you could do that via the GUI, but you could also do it via the REST API. So you can move the config file into a new environment and restore this. Unfortunately, that was a really manual process, as I said. The platform team really didn't like doing this for us. So they kind of became sort of really hating FME and really hating us, I suppose, for sort of putting them through this every time they want to do a deployment. It was such a manual process for them. It was a case of taking the file, putting it in the environment, and then about 15 steps or so to run through, sort of changing their commands to look to the new sort of name of the config file, because it's normally based on date. So they had to sort of change all their code, run it through, and sort of have about 15 steps, which often led to things being missed out and then obviously not working. And as I mentioned before, FME was such a sort of a key part to the whole ecosystem that when this wasn't working, there were some big issues. Also shipping the data, sort of, we had there was very large files, sort of 100 megabytes, and on particularly the production environment, there was no sort of internet access, no way to get to this data in sort of more standard methods you'd expect. So we had to sort of ship it on sort of USB drives, take this around, and sort of it took about 2 days. I think they called it sheep dipping, where it was had to sort of make sure that there was no viruses, everything like that, before they can actually even plug it in the live environment. So as you imagine, large files and a hell of a lot of sort of manual process, which really wasn't suitable. Although we did end up doing this for probably 18 months, 2 years, because once we had sort of a process in place that we knew could work, it's very difficult for the project to sort of adapt to a new one and sort of want to take on a new process. And also the timescales, we didn't really have time to come up with a new method of doing this. But the repositories got larger and larger as we went along. So the files were getting bigger and bigger, the config files, and we really had to get a new way of working. So we came up with a second solution, which is it's still a manual process, but we cut down on sort of file size and platform team manual steps. So the way we did this was using the repository reader in FME. So using the repository reader, rather than taking the whole of sort of the server config, we could take a specific repository we've been working on. Create an FFS file in the FME workbench. So you could run the repository reader, and produce this FFS file, which was a lot smaller than taking the whole repository. And also a bit safer, because when you got a lot of people working, we didn't have to take the whole server each time, which there could be repositories where people were sort of messing around on in the development environment. And you wouldn't necessarily know, because when you've got sort of 10 developers, sometimes you can lose track on what everybody's working on. So we're able to create these FFS files of just single repository. We still had to ship these off to platform team, but they're a lot more manageable size. We created a workbench to essentially read these in and write them to the server. So we were able to sort of limit the steps from about 15 on the previous iteration of this to probably about 4 or 5 for the platform team. So they were much happier to do this for us. And they were calling the workbenches via sort of the REST calls, so they didn't need to actually have FME installed and run it. So there were still a lot of problems with this, as this slide sort of indicates. Main thing is still a lot of manual steps, which isn't ideal because things go wrong. You know, as soon as you get manual steps in and tasks to follow, things will get forgotten, missed out, and it's obviously not ideal for a large-scale sort of productionized system. There's also the versioning. We still have the problem with the versioning. So, you know, you were still just taking repository, and the way we were doing it was just by sort of date. So we just create this FFS file and give it a different date, and just store these sort of on drives all over the place. But there wasn't sort of a proper structure around. And then also cost and time. So it's still manual steps, and it had to pay for a lot of platform time to do this. So it really wasn't, still not perfect. So more recently, though, we've sort of had time to reflect. The project's over, the large one we were on. We've had time to reflect and look at a way of, you know, we can actually improve this process and automate the deployment of FME. So I don't know whether anybody's been to Don's Docker presentation. I think there's one after lunch as well. I think he's doing it again. So I don't really want to go too much into Docker because he covers that really well, a lot better than I would in sort of 5 minutes. But essentially, for those who don't know, it's sort of containerization tool. And we use Jenkins to automate the process as well. So the way we worked, I'll run through sort of the steps for you in slightly more detail this time, because this is the solution that actually works. And this is, if you're going to take something away, this is the thing to take away. Forget the other 2 slides, because it's not a nice process. So we can do this on workbench level now by using Git. So Git, I don't know if anybody's used Git for FME as well, but it's not ideal. The reason being, sort of, it's the tracking the change is very difficult. So if you move a transformer, you know, move a bookmark, change a color or something like that, it's very difficult to see what's actually changed in, you know, in Git. You get sort of 2 different versions to match, see what's changed. So when you're doing code reviews, it becomes very difficult. But it still works. FME is essentially still code. So FMWs are still just essentially code. You can use Git-flow and version it that way. But as I say, the actual sort of checking and code reviewing side of it isn't spot on. We then sort of were able to use Jenkins to automate sort of deployment via sort of Git webhooks. So you could deploy to a branch in Git, and you could let Jenkins sort of monitor that, and then when it sort of saw a new change, so if you push to, say, development branch, Jenkins would recognize there's been change to that, and then build sort of a new FME container, and then from that, deploy that container to the environment. We then got notifications from Slack, so it was great. So a developer could sort of put in a new change. That change then would go to Git. You'd accept it, merge it into development branch. That would all be done. So that would be what the developer does. In the background, Jenkins kicks off, creates the Docker container, makes that, goes through the different environments with that, and then we get the notification back from Slack. So the developer's fully aware what's going on, but it's fully automated. So from sort of that first box, the developer, the platform team, they still need to be there to monitor, obviously, Jenkins and Docker, but they don't actually have to have any manual intervention. So no, we found it sort of it kind of sort of solved most of our problems we had on the previous slide. So the versioning is there now. It's not ideal for the code review, but it's there. We still have a version we can roll back, and the automation, so the time and cost, and the fact it can be done on the workbench level. So rather than the previous slide, you create these FFS files in a whole repository, which again, it's not brilliant if especially got a large repository with sort of few developers on it. But now you can make changes to particular workbenches and put it through that way. So this is the solution that we've kind of found has really worked for us. It's done the same way through all the code as well. In our sort of, as Rich said, we now moved on to this innovation team, and we're doing sort of lots of sort of proof of concepts and things. We're still using different technologies. They've got some Python code, Java still. And this process is identical for all of them. So FME is treated in exactly the same way as all the traditional sort of coding languages. So, which is great. So for a DevOps team, they know how to monitor it. They don't need a separate thing for FME. They can just have Jenkins and monitor them all by the same method. So there are still issues, though. Testing is one that we've always, particularly unit testing, something we've always struggled with. So you're making a change. How do you sort of test? You don't want to run the whole workbench again often, or the whole process to make sure that you haven't affected anything further down the line. So I saw a presentation early in the week by Tony and Baz from OS. I don't think are in the room. But Tony sort of touched on this and the way they get over it, which is sort of not really, I think he called it containerization really, which is creating a lot of small workbenches rather than having these big things, creating sort of a lot smaller workbenches. Or you could do that same via sort of custom transformers, but separating it that way, so it's more of a best practice thing. But that's how sort of he dealt with it. So you can have an input and output, you know what they're meant to be, and do it that way. So although it wouldn't fix the problem, but something that we've taken away from that is that best practice to sort of workbenches would help with that. But it's still not a real good way that we found to test. Code reviews, as I said, Git isn't ideal for them. So unless you're really strict with what you're changing, but if you sort of everybody moves things around, changes, positions of transformers, and that's going to affect code reviews and make it very difficult and unmanageable to really use Git for that. And then a best practice as well, just sort of when you've got so many developers, commenting and all these kind of things, styling, getting sort of a best practice solution, which is doable. That's just something that we haven't really implemented. So it's, we could have template workbenches, things like that. Just make it a lot easier when you're doing FME at scale and you've got so many different developers. That does become an issue when you're trying to hand over work. So we sort of want to potentially open the floor now to see if anybody's had any of these issues. So anybody's got over things like testing and things like code reviews, and if there's any sort of ways that people have managed to sort of do that, at sort of a large-scale project and manage to sort of implement a code reviewing or a testing methodology. Has anybody faced that problem?
I'm just kind of curious how you guys are doing your code reviews. Because what we do, because as you mentioned, there's no way you can do diff, right? So
Yeah.
you're looking at raw code. So what we do is we attach to our issue tracker a screenshot of the transformers that are modified or whatever. It's not ideal, but I mean it gives a little bit more insight into what dev is doing in terms of changes. So I was curious what you guys did.
Yeah, well, luckily for us, we're all kind of based in the same office. So I think the way we really did it was just essentially add a comment to a transformer and then look over the shoulder of the person. So for us, that works because we're all on site, all together in a very small environment. But yeah, I can imagine that wouldn't necessarily work, remotely. But no, it's very sort of simple. That's the only way we've done it yet. There's no sort of way probably sort of automating, make it sort of helping you do it. So as I said, Git doesn't really work for that.
Yeah, I think one challenge we've had with code reviews as well is when you're in a Scrum team and you might have one FME developer and the rest JavaScript developers, you're having to train those developers so they can review the code from the one guy doing FME. So actually sometimes the education piece is just as much of a challenge to make sure, and your tester as well, like it's fine testing code and see that button does that result, but when you show them this huge workbench and you've got 6 million records going in, 5.5 coming out, how would you actually get them to test that the workbench is doing what it's supposed to?
Yep, shoot.
Do you have a vision of how you would like to see it work?
A good way of sort of, well, the issue we get, as I said, is all the sort of moving parts and moving transforms, everything like that. So there's a way of sort of doing similar to Git and doing a diff, which wouldn't take into account things like positioning of workbenches, something that would look at potentially a transformer level and just what you're adding. I think it would be very difficult to do, but some way of just taking out all those external factors so we could do some sort of diff and some way that a review could just see exactly what's the important things that have changed. Whether you could flag that in the workbench or something saying only, these are the only bit I've changed, to ignore the other bits, because you can sort of do that when you're doing git add and things in Git using the other sort of Python, for example. You can just say don't add these bits, I've only actually changed this bit or this sort of part. So, but FME, there's no really way to do that. So maybe that you're flagging a particular bit that you changed, so that only shows up in the diff. Again, I don't know how that would work, but something like that. That's the issue we face. It's just that it's overwhelming. If you try and do a diff at the moment, you can't see what's changed.
Maybe if the map of the file was adjacent, not a map of the file.
Yeah.
Do you have any custom transformers? So one of the issues I've found is having a custom transformer that's linked, and then we'll be calling a stored procedure somewhere on the dev side,
Yeah.
and then that's updated for dev, but because it's a linked transformer,
Yeah.
it comes through into production,
Yeah.
and that thing's not necessary in production yet.
No,
Yeah.
luckily not. I mean, something I kind of don't particularly like using custom transformers. Although, seeing some talks this week, I'm actually going to try and experiment with them a bit more. But luckily not, because, yeah, that'd be the issue, having to add new steps to deployment of actually taking that after you've created and all that kind of thing. So luckily, we've avoided them. But, yeah, so luckily it's not been an issue for us. Yep.
How did you deal with the time scale of being in the Agile environment? For us, we've had to deal with large province-wide data sets and with millions of records, and we've had to test them not only on our computer, but eventually on dev and then on production. But then with the weekly time crunch, sometimes we skip some of those steps and just roll them out. How did you do that? Is your data just as big?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the challenges is data in dev and test environments. A lot of the times the project might not be able to afford to put all the data in there as well. So it was tricky. I don't think we found a perfect way of doing that really. Other than it's just time. It's like a lot of time when we were in those data kind of tests, we'd just get a tester and we'd sit them, take them through it, and they would just be visualizing data, running as many automated tests as they could on it. But yeah, it's how long you've got really, isn't it? And sometimes you get to the point where you just got to go with the testing that you can fit in that period. So yeah, I didn't think didn't really have a good answers for that other than just.
No, we always came up with sort of there's always going to be data anomalies and things you can't predict, and sort of issues in your data that when you're dealing with sort of at such large scale, we have sort of 5 million or so parcels, and they're quite big each. So there's always going to be some sort of geometry issue or something like that, or some data issue you can't really, you don't really get time chance to think about, and then you can't test, and then it will get its way there. But there was not really any way of us. We couldn't come up with a way of sort of fixing that, especially because we'd get. It was kind of constantly changing the data as well, so we'd get sort of new updates to the data, and we'd see things we hadn't seen before, and that would only be in certain environments, and it was just, there's no really way that we came up with fixing that. Yep.
Have you guys had issues when trying to merge from other branches and, say, having conflicts with FME translations? And if you have, how do you guys kind of overcome those? Do you say, just resolve using what was last pushed, or, what do you guys do in that case?
Yeah, so the only few times, luckily we haven't used this on a large project where it's sort of, we've had to worry too much about that. We just sort of take the new version. We'll just say, we'll just push it in, we'll just sort of force it in, if that's the case. So we still have the two versions of FME then. We've only really been doing it on sort of one branch and things and getting it in that way. So that obviously would be issues. There'd be so many conflicts when you're dealing with FME like this. So we've kind of limited it to a sort of one branch most of the time and just forcing things in if they need to. So that's, anyway, we've got around that. But Git would be an issue for that as well. It'd be an absolute nightmare with a load of conflicts if you've got tons of different people working on different things. Luckily, when our solution we've had at the end here, we've actually only used on small scale, really, smaller teams. We think it will work, for another large project. Will definitely be a lot better than we used to have anyway, which is the key thing. But luckily, we haven't really faced those issues. But no, they would obviously arise.
Did you have to innovate on how you use the published parameters? So the developer will be, modifying whatever values they want to call up these workspaces. Different environments or through different workspaces.
So we used config files for that, sort of text files we could use and read in. So we'd have essentially workspace runners inside, and we'd have sort of a larger workbench that sort of runs these, and then it'd read in the config files at the start and pass the parameters. So it would be sort of sitting in the different environments, the config file. It would stay there. You you wouldn't take that with you through the environment, so you just publish the workbench would go, but the config file would sort of stay there and use those parameters, which could be updated as well by platform team DevOps, because they obviously don't want to go into FME and use it, wouldn't necessarily have FME desktop installed, so using the config file kind of worked for us. They can just use any kind of text editor in Linux or something, just modify a file and get it through that way.
Yeah, one thing we did to make sure that was enforced is we used the workbench reader. So we had a bit of a code review workbench that you ran it read in the workbench. It looked for any database connections that weren't published parameters, so like hard-coded username or password or IP address, and then flag it out. And obviously, there's only so far you can go with that because you might miss one, but that kind of helped us catch any hard-coded values that a developer forgot to parameterize.
Brilliant.
Are there any other more questions, please, guys? All right.
Brilliant. Well, in that case, thank you. No, thank you very much for going. I know it's the end of the day. So cheers.